On the evening of July 27th, 1983, a Jeep Cherokee stopped outside Washington, D.C. offices of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or the CPB, the agency that regulates National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS. Upstairs, the CPB board was holding an emergency meeting to determine the fate of NPR, which after 13 years of existence had entered a financial tailspin. With only $20,000 in the bank and $9.1 million in debt, the network was near collapse. It might not last through the next day. Tensely, our story begins. That was an excerpt, the opening lines of On Air, The Triumph and Tumult of NPR, a tale that took author Steve Oney 14 years to complete. Fascinating, revelatory, and irresistibly dishy, this is a riveting account of NPR's unlikely launch, its chaotic ascent, and ultimate triumph. On Air delves into the history of NPR, highlighting key aspects of its journey from a unique newcomer to a major media force. Steve's new book offers a unique glimpse behind the curtain of NPR. Author Steve Oney joins us today. Steve is a longtime journalist who worked for many years as a staff writer for the Atlanta Journal, Constitution Magazine, and Los Angeles Magazine, among many others. Steve's first book, And the Dead Shall Rise, The Murder of Mary Fagan and the Lynching of Leo Frank, won the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award, the National Jewish Book Award, and the Georgia Historical Society's Malcolm and Muriel Barrow Bell Award. He is also the author of A Man's World, a collection of magazine articles drawn from his career writing for Esquire, GQ, Los Angeles, and the Atlanta Journal and Constitution Magazine. Steve Oney is a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. So for the listener, a little bit more about NPR. Founded in 1970, NPR is America's most powerful broadcast news network. NPR is a cultural powerhouse, and its hosts are a trusted voice for America. It has long been home to such shows as All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and This American Life, captivating millions of listeners in their homes, their cars, and workplaces across the nation. However, PBS and NPR stations are now on the verge of losing the federal funding that has helped keep them on the air for decades. NPR has made the case to listeners that elimination of federal funding would ultimately result in fewer programs, less journalism, especially local journalism, and eventually the loss of public radio stations, particularly in rural and economically distressed communities, which make up roughly 30% of NPR's revenue. Welcome, Steve. Congratulations on the new book. The timing is uncanny, no?
Jeremiah, I couldn't have asked for better timing, which I guess is why I got it, because if I had sought it, I wouldn't have gotten it. But
Right.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for reading those opening pages, which detail an earlier NPR crisis back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. And luckily for NPR, and I think luckily for America's listeners, NPR escaped that crisis. They were chastened, they were damaged, but they got through it, got over it, and thrived afterward. What we're seeing today in a eerie and uglier echo of what happened in the 1980s is much more serious. And NPR has actually entered a moment where it's at risk, and they will have to make financial cutbacks. They will have to make cutbacks, as you say, most severely at the station level. NPR is not really a true network as we think of networks. There are no owner-operated stations. There's a studio and production facility in Washington, D.C. that makes the shows. All Things Considered, Morning Edition, a number of other shows. Then the stations, which are scattered out over America, buy those shows from NPR and air them if they like them. And most stations do like them. But a big part of the cut that the Trump administration is making will take money from the stations, leaving the stations with less funds, fewer funds to buy the programs from NPR. So that's where the real danger is. The stations range from highly profitable big market stations in New York and Los Angeles, and for nonprofits, they make money, to struggling stations in small communities, farm communities. I was reading a story in the paper the other day about an Indiana station that specializes in crop reports. And, who wants to listen to crop reports? Well, if you're a farmer in Indiana, you do, and you're not going to get them in a commercial format. You're only going to get them from your NPR station. So that's where the loss is going to occur. Can those stations afford to continue that kind of specific programming for their listeners?
Well, for that, at that time, 1983, I think it was, that you describe in the opening chapter or the prologue of the book. For at that time, they were out of money and they were deeply in debt. And now you're saying some of the stations make money, but the rural stations that don't have the big markets to raise, to do the fundraisers on air and things like that, may not be able to afford the programming, which may lose listenership or sponsorship and donations. So it's another crisis right now, right? But it's different. Is it flatlined? Or will this be a final nail in the coffin? Do you think they'll reinvent themselves as they have done many times before?
I hope NPR reinvents itself. NPR has become a bit risk averse as an organization. When NPR began, it was the Wild West. They would try anything. They were open to experiments with sound and format and different kinds of reporting. But as most organizations do, as they went through a rowdy childhood and an unruly adolescence, they became respectable and they became a little less adventurous. I think for NPR to reclaim its centrality in the marketplace, they need to be more adventurous now. But the difficult task facing NPR is twofold. One, President Donald Trump has targeted it, and he dislikes it, and he wants to make it, if not go away, he at least very much wants to weaken it. Two, the media landscape has radically changed. With confidence, NPR in the 1980s or 1990s could be certain that across America there was an audience for two daily news shows that gave their listeners a full diet of the day's events, cultural, sports, news, international news. Now, in 2025, the media landscape is so fragmented. And even if you're in a small town, depending on your local station, you don't need your local station. You can go to social media, you can go to any number of
Right.
sources and get a version of the news. And I stress that word version because NPR and the big American newspapers and the news networks subscribe to the idea that there is a fair way to tell the country's story. And on social media and on the cable channels especially, you're getting information that is targeting you because of your political affiliations or your beliefs. And
Likes.
you watch for the fancy term is confirmation bias. You watch because those stations confirm views you already hold. And NPR and the big American newspapers come from a different place, which is, we might introduce you to a new idea. We might stretch you. You might not agree with this, but you might be changed after having considered it and listened to it. Hence the title of All Things Considered. It was a more polite world 55 years ago when NPR started. Now people are opinionated and they think they know what a story is before they've even heard anything about it.
Right. It's interesting. You brought up a moment ago that there's a rural station that gives a crop report, right? And there is interest in that location and that area for a crop report because it speaks to its audience there. It's interesting if I wonder if NPR, just thinking out loud, will be able to take this new media where it's geared towards the listener and their likes and everything they do online and what they read and starts feeding them what they want to hear. I wonder if there's a way to even do that, drill down on these NPR stations to kind of take that social media news model and somehow put it on airwaves. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. You sparked you sparked my interest on that
I think
idea.
the local stations can do it. I live in Los Angeles, and during the January fires of 6 months ago, one of our NPR stations, KPCC, it's now called LA List, was giving you almost block by block accounts of where the fire was burning and the escape routes and reports from engine commanders. And it was a thorough telling that was of importance in Los Angeles, but was of no importance whatsoever out in the country. It was important to those of us who were here. And commercial broadcast news wasn't doing it. And on some level, the websites of American newspapers were doing it. The test for NPR, the paradox of NPR is it is a radio network. And I'm contradicting myself. It's a radio broadcaster that assumes with its bookend shows, All Things Considered and Morning Edition, a shared interest. If NPR started putting that kind of news online, available on an hourly local basis, it would find itself in competition with its radio stations. So the fine balance that NPR has to strike is between terrestrial broadcasting, that's the business its stations are in, and that's how their model works, and the NPR.org website, which is an entirely different animal. So it's like in newspapers, there's a legacy audience that is coming with your print newspaper, but you can reach many more people with your online newspaper.
Digital. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. I hope they solve it. It's anybody I talk to that's under 30 ask me what radio is, and I always get blown away by that question. How do I find it? How do I find, because we are on radio. So how do we find you on radio? How do we do that in our cars, on our phone, et cetera? It's just not the same, I guess, as when I grew up and there was a radio in every car and a radio in every house. So they definitely need to pivot or adjust or figure that out. But this feels like a big blow and maybe, that a domino effect. Let's go back to you, Steve, for a minute, though, because I want to get to know you a little bit. Do you remember when NPR became a part of your life or radio even?
Well, I'm so old, Jeremiah. I do. It was in the 1970s, and I was working as a daily newspaper reporter in rural Georgia, and I had to drive all over. I covered 13 rural counties for a North Georgia edition of a South Carolina newspaper. So I spent a lot of time in my car, and I would listen to this thing, NPR. At that point, they only had one show, All Things Considered. And I thought it was interesting, and it made my life a little less lonely. It was quirky. It was not like straight news media. It was countercultural in a sense, a little like the underground press. And sometimes it was very, very good, and then other times it was awful. But it was always interesting, and I felt like I had a companion with me when I found it on the dial. I mean, that's the great thing about radio. It's very seductive. If you have someone telling you a story, so I found it seductive, and I still do. I've always loved radio too. I love play-by-play announcers for college football games and Major League Baseball games. I get hooked. they're telling me a story, even if it's just about what's happening in on the base paths at that moment. And it's narrative, it's storytelling. So I found it when I was just starting as a newspaper reporter, and have listened to it off and on ever since. Now, sometimes it became too earnest. Sometimes it became, I think, a little too liberal. Sometimes in the early years of the 2000s, I would, heaven forbid, listen to Adam Carolla, because I thought Adam was so irreverent that that was a nice antidote to the highly reverential quality of NPR. But that was a passing thing. NPR was always there, day in and day out. And sometimes it's the tiny aspects of a broadcast that are really appealing. If you're driving someplace and you don't know what's going on in the day and it's at the hour, you can go to NPR and get a 5-minute update on just about everything that matters at that moment. And to me, that's important for our American culture. It gives continuity. It gives us a sense of being in this together as opposed to alone. And to me, that's another power of the radio. It's a community building platform. It has not just even though it's very intimate, you think you're the only listener. There are many yous listening, and it's a paradox, but it's seductive. It's seductive to you, but it's reaching many others simultaneously.
So true. And I related to that story. I used to live in Santa Monica and Santa Barbara, and I would drive every week. I'd drive back and forth for work. And a lot of times, the only thing I could find on the dial was that NPR station, driving up the coast. And uh, you know, getting the news, like you said, and you don't think about that, but at some point that was very revolutionary, wasn't it? That was out of the norm, the way NPR structured their storytelling.
Well, commercial radio has sadly just about bit the dust. That whole notion of News 88, give us 20 minutes and we'll give you the world, that's basically gone. And what we have left is NPR. And NPR offers two kinds of satisfaction. It offers the satisfaction of those hourly news breaks. But then if you're in the car or you're just downloading it onto your computer, a show like This American Life by Ira Glass, you can listen captivated for an hour as he carefully explores, dramatically explores just one subject. And it's theater. It's well-produced theater, and it's accurate, it's factual. And I
It
don't
also sad.
listen to like a podcast like S Town. I find that unbelievably good, and it's as good as anything being done by documentary filmmakers. It is. I think that's a big part of the future of National Public Radio and public radio in general, to continue with this strength, which is storytelling.
What is it about the NPR story that inspired you, Steve, to spend almost 2 decades writing it?
Well, I should have my head examined, but what I thought was most interesting about NPR was, one, NPR is just a bunch of equipment. It's microphones, computers, desks, space on a satellite. But there are all these people behind it, and we think we know them, but we have no idea what they even look like. We've heard their voices, but I was captivated with the opportunity of finding out who they are and spending time with them and writing not just about their strengths, but their weaknesses and their rivalries and their love affairs. And it all seemed interesting to me. And I arrived at the notion that NPR is like a big family. Sometimes it's highly functional and they achieve enormous victories. Other times it's completely dysfunctional, and you wonder how in the world they stay in business. How do they continue to make the kinds of editorial mistakes they make? Well, the answer is no news organization is perfect, and they all make mistakes. So that was one of the attractions. And then another attraction was, what is NPR. It tells the story of the world. And it struck me that one of the opportunities in this book was I could tell the story of the last 50 years of American history, world history, over the shoulders of these talented people who were everywhere while those events were happening. So at one point in the book, you're getting a minute by minute account of battles in Iraq during the Second Gulf War. At another point, you're learning about the assassination of Ronald Reagan, and you're getting a blow-by-blow account of what was happening in Washington on that day. And then someplace else in the book, you're leaping to 9/11, and the planes are flying into the towers, and Bob Edwards, who was the host of Morning Edition the morning of 9/11, was out on the curb in front of the NPR headquarters smoking a cigarette and kind of unable to rouse himself to go back to the studio and do what he had to do. So you're seeing just these vistas of world and American history through the eyes and the ears of the NPR journalists. And, it's a real smart bunch of people. And I was a little intimidated when I was doing the book because everybody I talked to was smart. And I just thought these people really are pretty amazingly smart. And I'm going to have to run hard to catch up and stay abreast of them. So, but that was in its own way fun too, because I was always learning something new. And
Steve, I had the same feeling about talking to you today.
well,
This guy
thank
is
you. Well,
extremely
I'm smart
smart.
because I spent time talking with them. So this is a pass along value. You're getting their
Yes,
smarts
yes, a
via me.
trickle down. Uh, you mentioned earlier, there's a couple things there I wanted to touch on. One, you have this, you listen to these hosts, but you really don't see them. So you imagine, right? You imagine who they are. Number two, you finally get to meet them. Were they, and you know what they say about meeting your heroes,
Right.
it's not good to so now you've met them. Did they live up to what you had imagined of them? These big names, these great reporters, these iconic reporters, really, that we've all grown up with.
By and large, yes. I didn't suffer from hero worshiping per se. I've spent most of my adult life in the news
Admiration.
business, so I knew that everyone in it is human. But yes, I was impressed by their stories and by their humanity. Bob Edwards was the host of Morning Edition for nearly 25 years. He got up every day at 1 in the morning by setting his alarm clock on the far side of his bedroom, forcing himself to walk from the bed to the alarm clock so he didn't cheat and fall back asleep. And then NPR, without any ceremony, fired him, let him go. And I thought that's a really human story.
A really
What was
compelling part of the book.
what was his he had some failings. He'd gotten crusty and irascible, and maybe many people would. He was, you know, had a 10,000-yard stare by the end. But he was also a pro. He was good at what he did and didn't deserve to be treated that way. And so I was very impressed by him. One of the most, I think, heartbreaking stories in the book is the story of Ann Garrels, the great NPR reporter who covered the Iraq War. And NPR just left. She gained her first fame. She was the only American electronic reporter who stayed in Baghdad during shock and awe. Everyone else left. All the network reporters left, and she was there alone in a hotel room with trash cans full of water and Kit Kat bars and coffee and cigarettes, reporting on this mayhem going on right outside her window. She walked to her hotel window one morning and saw a cruise missile flying by at eye level, something few people have ever seen. And then it exploded into an Iraqi target. And the next year was suffering the equivalent of PTSD. Well, it wasn't the equivalent, it was PTSD. And NPR did not know how to help her. And as a consequence, they just sort of rudely shoved her aside. And it's a very fascinating story about human behavior under pressure. And there were some villains and there were some heroes in that story. And I felt it was a privilege as a storyteller to be able to tell it, to be able to research it with respect, and then try to tell it unflinchingly. And that's the kind of nonfiction I've been writing ever since, I said I worked for a small newspaper when I first started, but I was lucky enough at age 22 to go to work as a staff writer for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution magazine. And Jimmy Carter had just been inaugurated as president, and the magazine was making a lot of money. And I had an opportunity to go around the country as a young guy practicing this ambitious magazine journalism. So that's really what I've been trying to do throughout my adult career. And NPR was just a fantastic topic. And people would say, "Oh, you're working on a book about NPR. How fascinating. What a great subject." And I'd say, yes, but if the book works, it will be a book of great stories. The stories are what you're going to remember. The stories are what will draw you in, because nobody wants to read about a subject, but everyone wants to read about people in conflict or in triumph. And there's some of both in the book.
From the opening, first few pages throughout, it really takes you on a ride. Like when I mentioned I read that first paragraph, I was tense. I was like, I felt like I was along for the ride, or an observer, and I had a lot on the line as well as they all
That's
did.
great. That's music to my ears that you felt that way.
And I forget the gentleman's name. You just mentioned him, and he got fired. He had the 1,000-yard stare. Um,
Bob Edwards.
yeah, excuse me, Bob Edwards. He was so instrumental in changing the landscape, soundscape wise, and you know, he was so influential in what NPR has become in those early stages. And then he was fired. He was let go, and if I remember right, he has to work, so he folds newspapers
Well,
to
that
make.
was you're actually combining two
I'm like
stories, but
combining two
they
stories.
it's the same. Bill Siemering, who was the
Oh,
founding programming director of NPR, and he invented All Things Considered. He was a visionary, a genius of conception, but he was not a great manager. And as soon as All Things Considered started, the network realized this was a daily beast that had to be fed. It went through content voraciously. So you had to be well organized and prepared, and Bill was not. So Bill got fired, and he needed money, and he was in Washington, D.C. It was Christmas time, and this is the end of the chapter about Bill. He goes to work for the Washington Post in the press room, stuffing pre-printed advertising circulars into the finished newspaper for delivery. It was a manually done job then. So that was how he ended up, the inventor of All Things Considered. Well, it's not how he ended up. He ended up doing very well in a second act of his life. Bob Edwards, on the other hand, NPR got rid of him, but Bob was canny. And the CEO of SiriusXM was a fan of Bob, and Bob was being shown the door. Everyone knew it. It was ugly. It was clumsy. And SiriusXM came after Bob and offered him more money and a stock position. And so Bob left NPR in better shape than he was before. He was treated badly, but he not only landed on his feet, he landed in a better place than he had been at NPR, financially at least. Although the thing about NPR is the people who work there, they're there because they want to be there, because they want to make money, but they're there because they're getting to do great journalism, great broadcasting, trying things that are creative and challenging. And the atmosphere is largely encouraging. And it's not like the network TV news outlets that want you to get everything in a minute and 30 seconds. At NPR, you're encouraged, take a little time, try something innovative with sound. Yes, put your microphone over there. Or, in the early years, NPR did a story that's an insane story. They put a microphone in a watertight barrel and tossed it over Niagara Falls. and did a story about the sound of a barrel going down the falls. I mean, anything could be a story if it involves sound. And that's another thing I like about NPR. NPR believes in sound, and they look at the soundscape the way that people in television or the movies look at visuals. So NPR is really interested in the aural, AURAL, experience of life. And there's a saying around NPR, they want you to see through your ears. And that's the beauty of NPR at its best. The storytelling and the innovative use of sound is so good that you hear a story as if you're seeing it. And that's the gold standard at NPR. When a reporter or producer gets a hold of something and they feel they've achieved that, they can say, well, that's why we're here. And I don't think people at the commercial networks have that degree of satisfaction very often.
Were you pretty much granted full access, Steve, to everyone and to the
Yes and no. I mean, this was not an authorized book, so I don't think NPR is pleased with a lot of it. But I went and spoke to the powers that be, to the head of public relations and the person who was then CEO of NPR, and I said, I intend to do this. I have a book contract with Simon and Schuster. I'm going to be careful. Will you not stand in my way? And they said, no, we won't stand in your way. And in fact, if there are people here you want to talk to, and there were many people I wanted to talk to, we'll help you meet them and get to know them. It'll be their choice whether they want to actually go through with an interview, but we're not going to inhibit them or tell them no. And that's all you can ask for as a writer. If someone agrees not to frustrate you, this would have been a very difficult, probably impossible book to do if they'd said, we're going to make it hard for you to talk to Bob Edwards or to Susan Stamberg or whoever you think of. And they didn't. They made it, they didn't stand in my way. For that, I thank them.
Oh, there are so many questions I have for you, Steve. I think I'm going to just have to send our listeners to the book, go buy the book.
Thank you.
Um, there's so many milestones, pivotal moments, you know, things that I wanted to talk to you about. For you, what was the most, give us one example. We've only got 3 minutes left, but give us an example of a story that was pivotal in the shaping of NPR or was pivotal to your book, something that surprised you that the readers would be surprised to find out about. Tease us a little bit. Is there something that stood out to you as you wrote this book? On
Well,
air, the triumph and tumult of NPR.
one of the thrilling moments for me was getting to know Frank Mankiewicz, who was the president of NPR in the 1980s during this financial crisis. And Frank is sadly, he's no longer alive, but Frank was from a very distinguished family. His father wrote the movie Citizen Kane. His uncle directed the movie All About Eve. Frank had been Robert Kennedy's press secretary, had been George McGovern's campaign manager, and he landed at NPR and decided he was going to make it into a world-class news organization. And Bill Siemering, the man we discussed a moment ago, who was forced out and ended up stuffing ads into the newspaper at the Washington Post, he created it, but Frank grew it. Frank made it into what it is today. And it was just thrilling to talk to Frank. He was a great storyteller. He was incapable of uttering a boring sentence. He was funny. He was thoughtful. He was delightful. But he was also a bad businessman. And he made some bad financial bets that led to that opening chapter you talked about, where NPR suddenly found itself millions of dollars in debt and scrambling to get a bailout from the federal government. So it was just an unbelievable opportunity for me to get to know Frank, to hear his side of the story. And it's an opportunity that now won't be available to someone else because Frank is sadly dead. But one of the joys of being a journalist is you have a reason to call up interesting people and say, your story. The chapter about Frank in On Air is titled Citizen Mankiewicz, hence a nod to his father's movie, Citizen Kane. And I think it's an amazing chapter. It's got also, as a sidelight, sex, drugs, and rock and roll in it. So who could ask for more?
No one. That sounds great. That's the way to spend the weekend at the beach. It's summertime. Pick up this book. You're going to love it. On Air, The Triumph and Tumult of NPR by Steve Oney. Steve, it's been great to have you here. So we are at the end, but we're circling back to the beginning. I asked you this in the beginning. Where is NPR headed at this moment? If you're in the offices at NPR at the headquarters, what are they saying? What's happening? Where are they going? What do you think?
I think the people at NPR feel like they've been hit up the side of the head. They saw it coming, but they didn't think it was really going to come. And the head of the NPR news department just resigned yesterday. There will be more people forced out either by firing or forced to resign. There will be cutbacks. It's going to be an altered life for them, a life of less money and more conscious budgetary decisions, decisions based on the budget, not on creativity. But I would urge NPR to go back to its roots and to broadcast and report great stories, and that will see them through. But there's no way to sugarcoat this. This was a loss for public broadcasting, and I think a loss for the listeners of America. And I don't envy the people at NPR right now having to get through this and deal with it. And I hope at the end of it, we could say it will be the second triumph of NPR. But right now, they're in the tumult part.
I hope we can say that too. It's been a love of mine since I was a young boy. I've loved NPR and listening to the stories on the radio. I agree with you. Go back to more stories and really focus on that. I think we can all use those right now. We can all use some uh, learning about the world, learning about things that we don't specifically search out in our news feeds and our social media. Just give it a listen, click it on, however you can get to it. Listen to NPR and the great programming there and support it, continue to support it. I'd love to see it around for a long time. Steve Oney, thank you so much. This is a great book. It's pick it up. It's a hot topic right now. On Air, The Triumph and Tumult of NPR. You can go to simonandschuster.com. On Air, Steve Oney, and buy it there, or you can get it on Amazon. You can get it anywhere you get your books. Um, Steve, thank you so much.
Jeremiah, thank you. That is more than kind. I appreciate it, sir.
Okay, everybody, go turn on the radio, communicate, but listen more and evolve. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.